The flint struck once. The spark lasted half a heartbeat, just long enough to catch the shape of a hand. It burst from the wall without sound. No crumble of loose stone, no warning groan from the mortar. One moment the wall was solid, dark, unremarkable. The next, pale fingers, thick as iron bolts, caked in gray dust, wrapped around Elias's boot and squeezed. He went down hard. His satchel swung against his ribs, glass rattling inside. His knee hit the flagstone and he gasped. A short, sharp pull of air that scraped down his throat like sand. The mask caught most of it, the leather seal pressing tight against his jaw. But it didn't matter. Even filtered air in a place this deep tasted of rot and mineral damp. His lungs didn't distinguish between clean bad air and dirty bad air. They just responded with the same wet cough that had followed him since the salt mines outside Veld had collapsed and taken his health with them. He pressed his fist against the mask and coughed into his own palm. 3 short, controlled bursts. Then he exhaled, slow. Then he looked down at what had grabbed him. The hand was orc. He knew the proportions, the width of the palm, the length of each finger, the density of the knuckles that looked like stone sutured under skin. He'd patched enough orc laborers in the outer settlements to recognize the architecture. But this one was different. The skin had gone the color of old tallow, gray-green at the joints, white at the knuckles, and threaded through with something darker. Veins that pulsed faintly, even now, with a cold and rhythmic wrongness. Not the dark green of orc blood moving through healthy muscle. Something else. Something that lived in the crypt wall and had decided to use this orc as a door frame. He sat up. His lantern had rolled 2 feet away, still lit. The shuttered kind, a brass cylinder with a wick he'd trimmed that morning in the inn above ground. He hooked it by the handle, pulled it close, and held it low. The hand did not release his boot, but it had stopped squeezing. It simply held him, the way a sleeping person might hold a blanket without knowing they were doing it. He worked his boot free slowly, inch by inch, and the grip loosened without resistance. The fingers uncurled and went still. He raised the lantern. The wall was not a wall. It was a collapsed archway, filled in at some point, decades ago, maybe centuries, with quarried stone and packed rubble. But the rubble had shifted, settled, and through the gap at the base, half buried, lay an orc. She had been pressed into the space between the old arch and the new fill, her body oriented as though she'd wedged herself in deliberately, back against stone, knees drawn up, her chin resting against bronze-plated armor that had long since gone to rust along the edges. The breastplate bore a crest, or what had been a crest. The acid of the mold had eaten into it over the years until only the outline remained. 2 crossed spears above a crown, Royal Guard insignia. He'd seen it in a history text once, in a library in Veld that no longer existed. The rank below the king's personal chamberlain, a sentinel of the final court, sworn to the burial chambers of the last sunken king. Which meant this orc had been down here for a very long time. He pulled his medical shears from the front pocket of his satchel and crouched, studying the fungal veins at her wrist. They ran up her forearm and disappeared under the pauldron. He cut the rust-bitten leather strap at her shoulder to get a better look, peeled the bronze piece back, and found what he expected. The infection had spread from beneath the armor, not through it. She hadn't been attacked by something from outside. She'd been rotting from inside, slowly, the way everything in these crypts rotted, absorbed by the colony that lived in the walls and used the damp and the dark to spread. He opened his satchel, sorted through the vials by touch. He knew them all by the shape of their stoppers. Round meant salts. Flat disc meant smoke compounds. Pointed cap meant liquids. He pulled a pointed cap vial and held it to the lantern light. Liquid sulfur solution, concentrated. Enough to strip active fungal tissue without burning through orc skin, which ran about 4 times the density of human skin at the dermis. He'd learned that from an orc midwife in a border settlement who'd laughed at him when he'd asked, and then spent an hour explaining it in uncomfortable detail. He uncorked the vial, set it down, took out his cloth wrap and tied it around the lower half of his mask for extra seal. The sulfur fumes weren't dangerous at this concentration, but in a sealed space with lungs like his, unnecessary risk was the same as stupidity. He was not a brave man, he was a careful one. Those two things got confused for each other more often than they deserved. The orc's chest rose and fell. Barely, but it rose and fell. That settled one question. He checked her jaw, pressed 2 fingers against the side of her neck, felt the pulse. Slow. Heavy. Like a hammer striking something wrapped in wool. Still there, though. He picked up the vial. He poured. The liquid sulfur hit the fungal veins at her wrist, and the reaction was immediate. The gray-green threads recoiled, contracting like burning thread. The orc's fingers twitched. Her head moved against the stone, a slow roll to the side, and from somewhere deep in her chest came a sound, low and rough, like gravel sliding down a drain. Her eyes opened. They were dark. Not the kind of dark that came from low light. The kind that came from something older. A gaze that had spent years in the deep earth and had forgotten what it felt like to look at anything far away. She looked at the lantern first, then at his hand holding the vial, then at his face. The leather mask, the brass fittings at the temples, the tube at the jaw. Her expression didn't change, but the sound in her chest changed. It deepened. She looked at him the way a sentinel looked at something that had entered a restricted corridor. He held still. He'd learned, from border settlements, from arguments with garrison healers, from years of practicing medicine on people who didn't want to be treated, that the first 3 seconds after a patient regained consciousness told you everything you needed to know about the next hour. These 3 seconds told him to stay very, very still. She didn't move. That was the first thing he registered. Not relief, exactly, but a recalibration. He'd treated patients who woke swinging. Orc laborers from the Veld Basin who came out of fever with their fists already clenched. Years of hard living turning even unconscious instinct into a defensive reflex. He'd taken a split lip from one and a bruised collarbone from another. He'd learned to crouch low and present no sudden angles. She just looked at him. Her breathing was audible now, a thick, wet pull of air that rattled on the exhale like something loose inside her chest. Her jaw was set. The tendons along her neck stood out with the effort of holding her head up. And under the lantern light he could see the fungal veins clearly. They ran in 3 lines from her collarbone to the hinge of her jaw, pulsing faintly with each heartbeat. Not spreading. Not in the last 2 minutes, at least. The sulfur at her wrist had contained the immediate growth there, but the main colony was deeper, rooted somewhere near the sternum, and the lines at her jaw were just branches. He raised the lantern slightly, tilting it to get a better angle. Her eyes tracked the movement. Still sharp. Whatever the infection had taken from her body, it hadn't reached her mind yet. He kept his voice flat, calm. The same tone he used with anyone who woke up not knowing whether they were safe. "I'm going to check the veins at your jaw. I need you to hold still." She said nothing. He took that as permission, or at least not as refusal, and leaned in, bringing the lantern close. The veins at her jaw were cold to the touch, not the cold of poor circulation, the cold of something replacing the warmth from the inside. He pressed 2 fingers along the largest vein, tracking it back toward her ear, and felt the pulse beneath it, her own, and then slightly out of rhythm. Another, slower, heavier. The colony had its own heartbeat. He'd read about it once, in a forager's journal recovered from the eastern ruins. At the time, he'd dismissed it as dramatic exaggeration. He pressed his fingers harder. There it was, 2 rhythms sharing one body. He sat back on his heels and reached for his shears again. He needed to get the armor off her chest to assess the depth of the root system. He started on the left pauldron strap, already cut, and moved to the buckle at her side. The bronze was seized with corrosion, the pin fused into the catch. He worked it with the tip of the shear blade, careful, steady, the way he worked every small mechanical problem, which was the same way he worked every large one. Patience over force. He didn't have force to spare. The buckle gave. The breastplate shifted. She made a sound, not pain exactly, a warning, low and short. He stopped immediately and looked at her face. "The plate," she said. Her voice was wrecked, raw and dry, like the inside of the crypts themselves, all stone and no moisture. Each word came out separately, like it cost something to produce it. "Leave." "The plate. I need to see what's underneath it. You are not a sentinel." "No," he said. "I'm a physician. And there's a fungal root behind your sternum that's going to stop your heart by morning if I don't map it now." Silence. She looked at the lantern again. Her jaw worked slowly, the way people's jaws worked when they were fighting down a cough. Then the cough won. It bent her forward, or tried to. Her body resisted the movement, spine rigid with effort, and what came out was black, fine-grained, like ash. It drifted in the lantern light, and he turned his face away and breathed through the mask seal until it settled. When he looked back, she had straightened again. Her eyes were on him, steadier now, as though the cough had cost her something she'd decided to stop protecting. She opened her mouth. What came out was not a refusal, and not a question. It was a statement, delivered with the flat certainty of someone reporting a condition they'd already accepted. "The dead do not welcome living breath." He looked at her. The gray in her skin, the lines at her jaw, the breastplate she was guarding, not out of vanity, but because 300 years of training had made the armor feel like the only boundary between her body and the world that wanted to take it apart. "No," he said, "they don't. Lucky for you, you're not dead yet." She held his gaze for a long moment. He didn't look away. He'd learned, again from border settlements, from people who tested you before they let you close, that looking away first was the wrong answer. She leaned her head back against the stone. A small motion, almost nothing. But it exposed her throat, and it was the most trust she had in her right now, and they both understood that. He reached for the buckle on the right side and got it open on the second try. The breastplate came away. Beneath it, the linen underwrap, gray with age, stiff with old salt, had fused to her skin in 2 places where the roots had pushed through. He didn't pull. He took his small water flask, moistened the fabric, and waited. She made no sound during this. Her breathing stayed controlled. He recognized that kind of control. It wasn't calm. It was discipline applied like a clamp to something that hurt. The wrap loosened. He peeled it back a centimeter at a time. The root system was worse than he'd estimated from the jawlines. 3 primary roots, each as wide as his thumb, running from a central mass just below her left breast, up across the sternum and branching at the collarbone. The tissue around each root had gone pale, the color of old tallow, and where the roots pressed against bone, the skin had cracked in thin lines. Not deep. But the central mass, the junction point, sat directly over the cartilage above her heart. He took out his notebook, sketched it fast, rough lines, just enough to remember the layout when he needed both hands free later. He noted the rhythm of the secondary pulse through the roots, counted the branches, made a mark for each point where the root had anchored into muscle. "How long?" he asked without looking up. She took a moment. 40 days, since the lower chamber flooded." He finished the sketch, capped his pencil. "You've been down here 40 days with this." "I did not ask to be examined." "No," he said. He closed the notebook and looked at her. "You grabbed my boot." She said nothing to that, but the set of her jaw shifted, barely a single degree, and he had the impression she'd just filed that particular fact somewhere she didn't intend to look at again soon. He started repacking the immediate supplies back into his satchel, the vial of sulfur solution, the shears. He left the notebook out, capped his charcoal pencil, and slid it behind his ear. Then he opened a second vial, flat-stoppered, smoke compound, and lit it with a lantern flame. Pale white smoke curled upward, thin as thread. The smell of it was mineral and clean, something between chalk and cold rain. It wouldn't cure anything, but it would suppress the surface spore load in the air around her for the next 20 minutes, which would slow the spread and give her lungs something slightly less hostile to process. He set the vial on the stone beside her, stood up. His knees ached from crouching on cold flagstone. He pressed a hand to the wall and took stock of the corridor. The direction they'd come from, the direction ahead, the low archways strung with root tendrils that moved faintly in air currents he couldn't feel. Behind him, she watched the white smoke curl. He could hear her breathing change. Still rough, still wet, but the rattle on the exhale smoothed out slightly as the compound reached her. He didn't comment on it. He just stood there, reading the corridor, giving her time to sit with the fact that something had helped and that she hadn't had to ask for it. He uncorked the sulfur vial before she could object. The smell hit the air immediately, sharp and mineral, like struck flint held over a drain. He'd grown used to it over years of field work. Most people hadn't. He watched her nostrils flare, her upper lip pulling back slightly, the automatic disgust response of someone who associated that smell with cauterization and pain. Which was fair. That was exactly what it was for. "This will burn," he said. Not a warning delivered with gentleness, just a fact, stated in the same tone he'd used to report the weather. "The mold tissue will react before the compound reaches your skin. That reaction is the sound of it dying. Try not to move." She looked at the vial, then at his hands. Her eyes tracked to the roots at her sternum, visible now that the breastplate was off, and he watched her process what she was seeing. The width of the roots, the color of the tissue around them, the central mass sitting directly above her heart. He'd seen patients look at their own injuries in two ways. Some looked away. The ones who looked directly measured, cataloged. Those were the ones who'd already made a decision before the treatment started. She looked directly. "Do it," she said. He poured. The sulfur solution hit the uppermost root at the collarbone junction, and the reaction was immediate and violent. The root tissue contracted, a fast, wrenching pull like a rope snapping under load, and the sound it produced was exactly what the brief had prepared him for, and still managed to be worse in practice. A tearing shriek, high and dry, coming not from her throat, but from the mold itself, from the network of tissue being stripped away from muscle and cartilage. It lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then it dropped to a hiss, and then to silence. Risha's jaw clamped shut. Every muscle along her neck and shoulder went rigid, not flinching away, but bracing into it, the same direction as the pain rather than away from it. Her hands, flat against the stone floor on either side of her, pressed down hard. He heard the flagstone groan under the pressure of her grip. Her knuckles went pale at the peaks. She did not move. She did not make a sound. He poured the second application along the central mass. This time the shriek was longer. The root system was denser here, the colony's anchoring point, and the sulfur had to work through 3 layers of tissue before it hit the junction. He watched the surface reaction, the gray-green color bleaching out, the root edges curling and going black, the skin beneath emerging pale and intact, orc dermis dense enough to take the chemical load without blistering. The forager's journal had described it as comparable to tanned hide. He'd thought that was an insult. Now he understood it was just an observation about what centuries of adaptation produced. Her breathing had gone to short, controlled bursts. In through the nose, out through the mouth. He recognized the pattern, a pain management technique, deliberate and practiced. She'd learned it somewhere that required endurance over an extended period. Not a battlefield. Battlefields were short and loud. This was the kind of breathing you developed in a place where the pain was constant and had no predictable end. A mine, maybe, or a long siege, or 300 years in a crypt with a king's bones to keep. He poured the third and final application at the base of the largest root, where it disappeared beneath the lower edge of her ribcage. The shriek was short this time. The colony was already pulling back from the treated areas, contracting toward whatever lay deeper, and the root at the base came away cleaner than the others, less resistance, more retreat. He watched the surface tissue stabilize, the skin color returning toward its natural gray-green by slow degrees, the faint luminescence of the mold fading from the veins at her jaw. Not gone. The central mass was deeper than a surface application could reach. But the branches were dead, and without the branches feeding it, the mass would slow. He capped the vial, took a clean cloth from his satchel, and pressed it against the treated area at the collarbone, absorbing the surface residue. She hissed once through her teeth. The cloth was damp with alcohol solution, and the cleaned tissue was raw. He held the pressure steady, didn't ease off. Easing off too soon turned a clean wound into an open one. "The roots at the surface are dead," he said. "The central mass is still active. I can't reach it without a scalpel, and time we don't have right now." She said nothing. Her breathing was returning to normal, still rough, still wet with the infection's residue, but the rattle had changed. Lighter. The branches of the colony had been doing most of the structural work of the infection in her upper chest, and without them, her lungs had a fraction more room to function. He took that as a temporary success, and nothing more. He started repacking his satchel, organized the remaining vials by priority, what he'd need fast, what could stay buried. He had 2 more sulfur solutions, a set of salts, 3 smoke compounds, a vial of alcohol, and his surgical kit, which he hadn't opened yet. The kit was the item he was most careful with. The scalpel, the bone needle, the gut thread. He'd carried that kit for 9 years and used it in places that had no business being treated as operating theaters. Cave floors, market stalls, the back of a moving supply cart. He wrapped it back in its oilskin and set it at the top of the satchel where he could reach it without looking. Risha moved. A slow, controlled push from the stone floor, her palms flat, her weight redistributing as she worked herself upright against the wall. He watched her do it without offering a hand. She hadn't asked, and she moved with the deliberate economy of someone who knew exactly what her body could manage, and was managing it precisely. No excess, no waste. When she reached fully upright, and fully upright on her was something else entirely, her head clearing the low arch above by barely a handspan, she stood still for a moment, breathing. Then she looked down at him. He was still crouching, closing his satchel buckles. He was not a tall man on his best days, and this was not his best day. She studied him the way she'd studied the vial. Direct. Cataloging. "You are from above," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Why are you in the crypts?" He slung the satchel strap over his shoulder and straightened. His knees registered their objection, and he ignored them. "Foraging. There are fungal compounds down here that don't grow anywhere else. I use them in treatments." He paused. "Used to, before I understood what colony they were part of." She looked at the treated roots on her chest, at the blackened edges of dead tissue. Then she reached down and picked up her breastplate from the floor, one-handed, the weight of it nothing, and held it against her chest without fastening it. The buckles on both sides were beyond repair without tools. She held it in place with her forearm pressed across it, armor as pressure bandage. He adjusted his mask seal and turned to look at the corridor ahead. The lantern light reached about 4 meters before the dark absorbed it. Somewhere beyond that, water moved. A slow, heavy sound, like something vast shifting in its sleep. "The lower chambers flood," he said. "You said 40 days ago." "The fungus follows the water." "Which means the exit corridors are compromised." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "The east corridor collapsed 20 days ago. The south gate is sealed." "What's left?" "The processional passage, north. It runs under the king's vault." He looked north. The corridor bent left about 6 meters ahead, and beyond the bend, the darkness was complete. "How long is it?" "Long," she said. And then, after a pause that felt like it cost her something, "I do not know anymore. The markers are gone." He picked up the lantern, checked the oil level through the sight glass at the base. Enough for 4 hours, maybe 5 if he kept the flame low. He adjusted the wick down a notch. Then he started walking north. Behind him, after a moment, he heard the slow, heavy sound of her following. Her footsteps on the flagstone were nothing like he expected. Not loud, careful, measured. The walk of someone who had spent centuries learning exactly where to place weight so the floor beneath didn't speak. He kept his eyes on the dark ahead. He did not look back to see if she was keeping up. She would keep up, or she wouldn't. Either way, standing still in a flooding crypt with an active fungal colony was the one option he wasn't willing to take. The bend swallowed the lantern light and gave nothing back. He walked into it anyway. The water hit his boots at the bend, not a trickle. A flat, still surface that began where the corridor leveled out and stretched ahead as far as the lantern reached. Knee-deep, covered in a film that caught the light and threw it back green. He stopped at the edge and held the lantern low. The film moved in slow circles that had nothing to do with the water beneath it. The colony's surface layer spread thin across the flood. He stepped in. The cold came through his boot leather immediately. He shifted his satchel above the waterline and pulled his metal cane from the side loop. Tap left, solid. Tap center, solid. Tap right, nothing. The cane dropping half a meter before finding bottom. He stepped left and moved forward. Behind him, Risha entered the water without pause. It rose to mid-thigh on her and stayed there. Where it reached his knee, it barely touched hers. She carried the broken stone pillar she'd pulled from the collapsed section near the arch, dragging it through the water behind her with one hand. The weight of it would have pinned him to the floor. She held it like a walking staff. The processional passage was wider than the corridor behind them, wide enough that the lantern light didn't reach the walls. The ceiling was vaulted, the upper arch lost in darkness. From somewhere above, long root tendrils hung motionless, ending at various heights, some stopping 2 meters up, some trailing in the water at their tips, like wicks drawing moisture upward. He ducked under the first cluster. Risha walked beside him. Her shoulder passed through the hanging roots without slowing. They dragged across the crown of her head, and she ignored them. He adjusted his path to follow hers through the thicker clusters and found it easier going. The water smelled of mineral cold and something underneath, a sweetness that didn't belong underground. Fungal metabolic output, the colony processing whatever the flood had carried down. He breathed through the mask and kept moving. "The king's vault," he said, keeping his voice low. Sound carried strangely here, flattened by the water, then bouncing off the vault above. "How far?" "3 chambers," Risha said. Her voice was better than before. Still rough, but the cadence had changed, less effortful. "The antechamber, the hall of record, then the vault. The north exit is a service passage beyond it." "When did you last check the service passage?" A pause that lasted 4 steps. 60 days ago." He said nothing to that. 60 days was long enough for everything to change underground. Stone shifted, water rerouted. The colony could seal a passage so thoroughly that moving through it became the same as moving through solid matter. He tapped ahead and kept walking. The water level rose as the passage descended. His legs went numb below the knee. He lifted his feet higher with each step to clear the raised flagstone edges, slower but safer than shuffling blind through the green-filmed dark. Risha reached out and pushed a matted root cluster aside, thick as rope, blocking the passage at head height. She held it left without comment, and he walked under it without slowing. He noted the way she did it. No announcement. Just saw the obstacle, removed it, waited. The way you moved with someone you were navigating with. He wasn't sure she noticed she'd done it. The first sinkhole caught him 2 minutes later. His cane found nothing. His left foot found nothing either. Just open water and a crumbling edge. He pulled back fast and stood still while his heart did something unpleasant. He breathed through it. 4 counts. The mask flexed at the jaw seal with each exhale. Risha stopped beside him. She probed the sinkhole's edge with her boot, tracing the boundary of it, then found where the floor returned and stepped there. She looked at him and waited. He followed her line exactly. The floor held. The lantern flame dipped in moving air from somewhere ahead. A chamber opening up. The antechamber, close now. He turned the wick up a notch. At the edge of the light, something shifted under the water. A slow displacement, like a mass turning in the silt. Then, stillness. The green film closed back over the disturbance, smooth and seamless. He stopped. Risha's pillar rose from the water beside him. They both watched the same spot. The film kept its slow, circular drift, indifferent. He waited 1 breath. Then he moved forward, cane tapping, lantern high. Whatever was beneath the water did not move again. But the antechamber was still a full corridor length ahead, and the dark between here and there held its secrets flat against the bottom. He kept walking. The antechamber doorway had no door left. Just a stone arch, the timber frame rotted to black stumps at the hinges. The opening filled with hanging root tendrils so dense they formed a curtain. He pushed through first, using his forearm to sweep them aside, and the water on the other side was shallower, ankle-deep, the floor rising toward the chamber's center. He exhaled. Small mercies. The antechamber was circular. 6 alcoves cut into the walls, each holding a stone bier, each bier holding the remains of what had once been royal guardsmen. Bronze armor, same crest as Risha's, 2 crossed spears above a crown, though here the metal had gone fully green with age. The bones beneath were undisturbed, arranged even. Hands folded, weapons laid flat across the chest. He counted the alcoves. 6 guards, 6 sets of remains. He turned to say something to Risha and found her already inside, standing at the chamber's edge, looking at the alcoves with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not grief, exactly. Something older than grief. Recognition, maybe. The specific weight of seeing something you'd known for a very long time, finally rendered into ruin. He looked back at the nearest beer and stopped. The hands had moved. Not the folded arrangement he'd registered 10 seconds ago. The fingers were spread now, flat against the bronze breastplate, pressing into it. He watched one finger bend, slow, deliberate, like something learning how a hand worked from the inside. The mold glowed along the bone seams, faint, pulsing. He had his satchel open before he finished the thought. Saltpeter pouch. A dense paper packet, the size of his fist, filled with a compound that burned white and dry when it hit air. He used it for surface decontamination in enclosed spaces. He'd never thrown one at an animated corpse before. He threw it now. The packet hit the beer and split. White smoke erupted from the impact point, thick and fast, billowing across the guardsman's chest and up through the alcove. The mold reacted immediately. The glow at the bone seams flickered, dimmed, the pulsing rhythm stuttering. The animated remains went rigid, fingers locking mid-motion, the whole frame seizing like wet wood in frost. The smoke reached Elias. He turned his face away and pressed the mask seal with his palm, felt his chest tighten despite the filter. His lungs registered the compound as an irritant regardless of what the mask blocked. He coughed. 2 short bursts, controlled, the kind he'd trained himself to produce so they didn't compound into something longer. His eyes watered. Behind him, Risha moved. She came through the smoke without hesitating, pillar already swinging in a low arc from her right side. It connected with the guardsman's torso at the midpoint. Not a strike, exactly, more a sweep, the weight of the stone doing the work rather than any particular force she applied. The dried, smoke-brittle remains came apart at the contact points. Bronze armor clattered against the bier. What had been a guardsman was dust and dry fragments before the echo finished crossing the chamber. She lowered the pillar, looked at the alcove, then at the remaining 5. All 6 biers were moving now, slow but moving, fingers pressing, helmeted heads turning by degrees on the stone surface beneath them. He already had the second saltpeter packet out. He looked at her. She looked at the alcoves, then at him, then at the pillar in her hand. A shared accounting that took less than 2 seconds. He threw both packets simultaneously, one left arc, one right, and the smoke hit 3 alcoves on each side. White billowed to the ceiling. He dropped low, below the worst of it, coughing into his mask, eyes burning. Through the haze, he heard the pillar swing twice, 3 times. The brittle percussion of ancient bone and corroded bronze folding under impact. Then silence, except for the drip of water from the arch behind them and his own unsteady breathing. The smoke thinned. He straightened. 6 alcoves, all still. Dust settling across the shallow water at the chamber floor, drifting in slow patterns. He pressed a hand against the wall and focused on breathing. In through the nose, slow. Out through the mouth, slower. The compound irritation would pass in a few minutes. It always did. His lungs just needed to be reminded they weren't dying. They'd been convinced of that before. Risha stood in the center of the chamber. She looked down at the closest pile of remains. A fellow sentinel. Same crest on the ruined breastplate, same folded hand arrangement now scattered across the bier. Something moved through her expression and was gone before he could name it. "They were your unit," he said. "They were dead," she said. "What moved them was not them." She said it with certainty, the kind that came from having already argued the point with herself extensively before arriving at the answer. He understood that. Some conclusions you reached, not because the logic was easy, but because the alternative was unbearable. He capped his satchel and checked his remaining packets. 2 saltpeter left, 3 smoke compounds. He did the arithmetic against the chambers ahead and did not like the result. "We need to move faster," he said. Risha was already walking toward the Hall of Record. The alcove was dry. That was the first thing he registered when Risha pushed the side panel open. A seam in the Hall of Record's wall, invisible until she pressed her palm flat against a specific stone, and the whole section pivoted inward on a central pin. Sentinel knowledge. The kind of information that didn't exist in any text he'd ever read. She'd known it the way she knew everything about this place, not from memory, but from the body. Years of walking the same corridors until the path lived in muscle rather than mind. He stepped inside. The alcove was small, a maintenance space, he guessed, used by the burial workers to store equipment during interment ceremonies. Stone shelf along one wall, a pair of iron hooks above it, a ventilation shaft cut diagonally through the ceiling toward the surface. The shaft was narrow, barely a forearm's width, but air moved through it, cool and slow, carrying the faint mineral smell of open earth rather than the colony's sweetness. He stood under it for a moment and just breathed. His lungs registered the difference. Not gratitude, exactly. Just a slight easing of the constant background resistance that had been his normal for the last 3 years. He set the lantern on the stone shelf and opened his satchel. Took out the brass bowl, flat, wide, the size of his palm, and packed it with dried sage from the oilskin pouch at the bottom of the bag. He kept the sage for personal use, for exactly this kind of stop. He lit it from the lantern flame and set it on the floor under the ventilation shaft. The smoke rose thin and pale, drawn upward by the air current, and the smell of it displaced the sweetness of the colony within a minute. He took off his mask. The cold air hit his face, and he let it. His skin was pale underneath. He knew that without needing a mirror. The mask left pressure marks along his jaw and across the bridge of his nose, red lines that faded slowly. His eyes were ringed dark, the kind of dark that came from years of poor sleep in poorly ventilated spaces. He sat down against the wall, stretched his legs out, and breathed. Risha settled against the opposite wall. The alcove barely contained her. Her knees were drawn up, her shoulders brushing the stone on either side, the pillar laid across her lap. She watched the sage smoke curl toward the ventilation shaft with the focused attention of someone observing a thing they had never seen before. Which was probably accurate. He doubted the last king's sentinels had carried much dried sage. "You fight with smell," she said. "I fight with chemistry," he said. "Smell is a side effect." She considered that. Her eyes moved from the smoke to him, to his face without the mask, the pale skin, the dark circles, the shallow rise and fall of his chest when he breathed. She catalogued it the same way she'd catalogued the vial earlier. Direct, without performance. "Your lungs," she said. "Old damage," he said. "Salt mine collapse. 3 years ago." She said nothing to that, but she shifted her position slightly, angling her shoulder away from the ventilation shaft, giving him a clearer line to the moving air. A small movement, probably automatic. He took the cleaner airflow without comment. He reached back into the satchel and found his surgical kit, unwrapped the oilskin, laid the scalpel, the bone needle, and the gut thread on the stone shelf in order. Then he lit a second sage bundle and held the scalpel blade in the flame, not long enough to damage the edge, just long enough to sterilize the first centimeter of metal. He did the same with the needle. "The central mass," he said. "It needs to come out tonight. If we leave it until morning, the roots will reestablish through the treated tissue." He looked at her. "I'll need to cut along the lower edge of your rib cage. Find the junction point and separate it from the cartilage above your heart." She looked at the scalpel, at the flame still moving along the blade. "How many men have you killed doing this?" "None," he said. "2 came close. Both survived." He set the scalpel on the shelf. One of them was an orc, if that matters to you. It didn't seem to matter to her. Or it mattered in a different way than he'd intended. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the sage bowl. The smoke moved steadily upward, thin and clean. Then she reached up and began unstrapping the breastplate. She'd managed a temporary fix with a strip of leather cut from her boot. Not elegant, but it had held the plate against her chest through the antechamber. She removed it now, set it aside, and peeled the underwrap away from the treated roots with careful fingers. The blackened tissue came away clean. Beneath it, the skin was intact, slightly raw. The central mass was visible, a raised ridge, gray-green, sitting directly above the cartilage of her lower sternum. She leaned her head back against the stone. Her eyes went to the ceiling. Her arms settled at her sides, hands open and flat against the floor, her throat and chest fully exposed. She stayed perfectly still. He understood what it cost. Not the physical vulnerability. She'd calculated that and accepted it. The other kind. The kind that came from a life built entirely around the principle that no one stood behind you, so you never turned your back. She was offering him the blade and her stillness both, and the only thing she was working from was the evidence of the last 2 hours. He picked up the scalpel, pressed 2 fingers against the central mass to locate the junction point. Found it, a firm ridge, the root anchored into the cartilage with 3 separate attachment points. He made the first incision along the lower edge, shallow and precise. She didn't move. Her breathing slowed to something almost meditative. In through the nose, long and controlled. He worked without speaking. The mass separated cleanly at the first 2 attachment points. The third was deeper, requiring him to widen the incision by 2 millimeters. He did it in one steady draw of the blade and felt the resistance give. The mass came free. Small, the size of a walnut, dense and cold in his fingers. He set it in the brass bowl, and it sat there, gray-green and still, the colony's anchor point, already dying outside the body. He pressed the alcohol-soaked moss pad against the incision and held it. Risha exhaled, long and slow, the first fully unobstructed breath she'd taken since the flood, her chest rising without the mass pressing against the cartilage above her heart. He stitched the incision with 4 passes of gut thread, tied each pass separately, cut the excess with his small scissors and repacked the kit without rushing. When he looked up, she was watching the mass in the brass bowl, watching it go still. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. He tied the last stitch and set the scissors down. The incision was clean. 4 passes of gut thread, each knotted separately, the edges sitting flush without tension. He'd done worse work in better conditions and better work in worse ones. This fell somewhere in the middle, which was acceptable. He pressed a fresh pad of alcohol-soaked moss against it and held pressure with 2 fingers. The bleeding was minimal. Orc tissue closed fast, the density of it working in their favor for once. He counted to 60. Old habit from his training years, when his instructor in Veld had told him that every surgeon who skipped the count eventually regretted it. He'd skipped it once, early on, and had spent 40 minutes managing a bleed that patience would have prevented. He hadn't skipped it since. Risha hadn't moved. Her head was still back against the stone, her arms at her sides. Her breathing had settled into something even and deep. The first full respiratory cycle he'd heard from her that didn't carry the wet rattle of the colony's pressure against her chest. The mass in the brass bowl had gone fully gray. Whatever biological rhythm it had carried inside her body, it didn't maintain it outside. It was just tissue now, cold and inert. He lifted the moss pad. The incision held. He cut a strip of clean linen from the roll in his kit and laid it across the wound, pressing the edges down against her skin. Her skin was warm now, warmer than when he'd first touched her in the collapsed arch. The fever was breaking. The sulfur applications had stripped the colony's surface network, and without the central mass feeding back through the roots, the infection had lost its organizing structure. Her body was already beginning the work of reclaiming the cleared tissue. He repacked the surgical kit. Oilskin wrap, tight, the same order as always. Scalpel first, needle second, thread last. He set it at the top of the satchel. "Done," he said. She brought her head forward from the wall. Slowly, with the measured care of someone checking whether a repaired thing would hold. She looked down at the linen strip across her ribs, pressed 2 fingers against the edge of it, not at the incision, beside it, testing the surrounding tissue. He watched her catalog the result the same way she cataloged everything, direct, without ceremony. "It is tight," she said. "The thread will loosen as the tissue settles. 2 days." He paused. "Don't flex the left side harder than you need to." She looked at the pillar across her lap, then at him. A flat look that communicated, without words, that the instruction was noted and would be observed precisely as far as circumstances permitted, which was to say not at all if the circumstances required otherwise. He accepted that. He'd given the instruction because it was medically correct, not because he expected compliance. He picked up his mask from the floor beside him, turned it over in his hands, checking the seal. The leather was good. He'd treated it with oil 3 days ago, and the jaw gasket was intact. He'd made the mask himself, 2 years after the mine collapse, when it became clear that his lungs weren't recovering, and that unfiltered air in enclosed spaces was accumulating damage faster than rest could repair it. The brass fittings had come from a salvage market in Veld. The filter compound he packed into the interior chamber he made himself. Activated charcoal, ground salt, and a proprietary blend of dried compounds that he'd spent 8 months refining. It wasn't perfect. Nothing about his situation was perfect, but it kept him functional in conditions that would have stopped him otherwise, and functional was enough. He set the mask on his knee and looked at the sage bowl. The bundle had burned down to ash, the smoke thinned to almost nothing. The air in the alcove still carried the clean mineral current from the ventilation shaft. He had 1 more bundle. He decided to save it. Risha reached over and picked up the mask. He stilled, a reflex, the way you stilled when someone picked up something that kept you alive. She turned it over with the same 2-fingered examination she'd applied to her own wound, studying the construction, the brass fittings at the temples, the tube at the jaw, the layered leather at the seal edge. She pressed her thumb against the gasket and felt it compress and return. "A man who cannot breathe," she said. She wasn't looking at him, still looking at the mask. "Plans to survive the deep earth. He's managed so far." She set the mask down on his knee, not handed it back, set it down, precisely where it had been, the same orientation. "The mine," she said. "You were inside when it collapsed." "I was treating a laborer, a lung infection." He picked the mask up and turned it over once more before setting it aside. "The irony wasn't lost on me." She was quiet. The ventilation shaft moved air over them both, steady and slow. Her breathing continued its new, unobstructed rhythm. He listened to it the way he listened to all his patients' breathing, clinically, tracking the quality of each cycle. Clear on the inhale, clean on the exhale, no rattle, no colony resistance. Just a body doing what bodies did when the thing pressing on them was removed. He leaned his head back against the wall. His own chest was tight, not acutely, just the baseline tightness that lived there permanently now, the residual scarring from the mind doing its quiet arithmetic against every breath. He was tired. The work of the surgery, the cold of the water, the compound irritation from the saltpeter smoke in the antechamber. All of it had accumulated into a specific kind of exhaustion that sat behind his eyes and in the muscles of his forearms. He closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. "Sleep," Risha said. "I'm not sleeping. You are doing the thing before sleeping." He opened his eyes. She was looking at him now, and there was something in the set of her expression that wasn't quite humor, but was adjacent to it. He'd learned in border settlements that orc humor rarely announced itself. It arrived flat and dry, and if you weren't paying attention, you missed it entirely. "1 hour," he said. She picked up the pillar from her lap and laid it across the alcove entrance. A barrier. Not much. Stone against animated dead was a temporary solution at best. But it was a statement. She was taking the watch. She was telling him that without saying it, the same way she'd cleared the root clusters in the passage without saying it, through the action rather than the offer. He adjusted his coat against the cold of the wall and closed his eyes again. His lungs rose and fell, slowly, evenly. In the alcove's small dark, with the sage ash cooling in the brass bowl and the ventilation shaft breathing cold air over them both, he slept. He woke to the sound of her sharpening stone, a slow, rhythmic drag of whetstone against the edge of her belt knife. Not a weapon exactly, more a tool, the blade wide and flat, the kind used for cutting rope and prying mortar. She was running the stone along it with the patience of someone who had done the same motion 10,000 times and found something close to stillness in the repetition. The sound was steady, grounding. He'd slept to worse. He sat up. His back registered the stone wall behind it, and his legs registered the cold, and his lungs registered the air, still clean, still moving through the ventilation shaft above. He checked his coat pocket for the timepiece out of habit, then remembered he'd left it at the inn above ground. Unnecessary weight, he'd thought. He pressed his palm against the floor instead and gauged the cold of it. Deep cold, bone-settled. More than 1 hour, closer to 2. He looked at Risha. She was in the same position as before, back against the wall, pillar across the alcove entrance, knife across her knee. But her posture had changed, less rigid. The line of her shoulders had dropped 2 degrees from the sentinel's brace she'd carried since the collapsed arch. She was still watching the entrance, still tracking. But the quality of the attention was different, maintained rather than braced. She had been sitting with the watch for 2 hours in a sealed alcove in the deep earth, and she had let her shoulders drop. He filed that away and said nothing about it. He reached for his satchel and found it exactly where he'd left it, but repositioned slightly, the flap facing outward, the buckles accessible. She'd moved it at some point during the watch, put it where he could reach it fast. He didn't know when. He hadn't heard her do it. He checked his supplies without unpacking everything. 2 saltpeter packets remaining, 3 smoke compounds, 1 sulfur solution. Surgical kit intact. The alcohol flask was lighter than he'd like. He'd used most of it on the moss pads during the extraction. He had enough for 1 more dressing change. He pressed 2 fingers against his own throat and counted his pulse. Even. A little fast from the cold, but even. His lungs were tight in the way they were always tight after enclosed sleep, the scarred tissue slow to loosen. He breathed through it. Gave it time. It loosened, partially, the way it always did. Partial was enough. He picked up the fresh moss pad from his kit and turned to her. "I need to change the dressing." She sheathed the knife and turned without comment, pulling the edge of her underwrap aside. He peeled the linen strip back carefully. The incision had closed well. The thread was holding, the edges sealed, the surrounding tissue returning to its natural color. He cleaned the surface with the last of the alcohol, pressed a fresh pad into place, and rewrapped it with the linen. 4 passes. He tied it at the side rather than the front, away from the incision site. She pulled the underwrap back into place, tested the range of movement with a slow turn of her torso, left, then right. He watched her register the difference. The left side still carried the surgical tightness he'd warned her about. The right moved freely. She nodded once, the private nod of someone updating an internal inventory, and reached for the breastplate. He helped her with the makeshift strap. 2 hands were faster than one, and the leather was stiff. She let him work the buckle end without pulling away from it, which was a different kind of trust than the surgery. Quieter, more ordinary, and for that reason harder to offer. "We have 2 saltpeter packets," he said, smoothing the strap flat. 3 smoke compounds, 1 sulfur solution. He sat back. "Enough for the Hall of Record and the vault, if we move fast and don't encounter more than the antechamber count." "There will be more," she said. "The Hall of Record held 12. He did the arithmetic. 2 packets covered 6 alcoves at best, if the smoke dispersed well. The rest would fall to her. He looked at the pillar. She followed his gaze. "It will hold," she said. He believed her. He'd watched it take apart 3 animated guardsmen in the antechamber without her adjusting her grip once. He put his mask on, worked the jaw seal, pressed it flat at both temples, exhaled hard to check the fit. The filter compound had a few hours left in it before it needed replacing, which he didn't have material to do down here. He'd manage. He pulled his cane from the satchel loop and stood. Risha stood with him, filling the alcove, and reached past him to lift the pillar from the entrance. Then she stopped, set it back down, reached instead into the gap above the stone shelf, and pulled out something he hadn't noticed during the surgery. A folded piece of leather, stiff with age, wrapped around a flat object. She unwrapped it. Inside was a bronze disc, engraved, the size of her palm. The King's seal. She looked at it for a moment, then folded it back into the leather and pressed it into the gap in the wall. She didn't explain. He didn't ask. Some things you left where they belonged. She picked up the pillar. He picked up the lantern. He pushed the alcove panel open, and the smell of the colony hit them both immediately, the sweetness rising, thicker than before. He adjusted the mask seal with his palm. "The Hall of Record," he said. "Straight ahead," she said. 40 steps. He stepped into the corridor. Behind him she followed, and the panel swung shut on the sage ash and the cold air and the small, quiet space where, for 2 hours, nothing had tried to kill them. 40 steps ahead the darkness waited. He counted them as he walked. He reached 38 before the floor vented. No warning crack. No tremor in the stone beneath his boots. The vent simply opened. A seam between 2 flagstones that had been sealed with compacted silt, and whatever pressure had been building beneath it finally found the path of least resistance. A column of yellow smoke drove upward from the gap with enough force to flatten the lantern flame sideways. He threw his arm across his mask seal by reflex and took 2 steps back. The yellow spread fast. Not drifting, expanding. The way something expelled under pressure expanded, filling the corridor from floor to ceiling in the span of 4 seconds. He'd read about hallucinogenic spore clouds in the Forager's Journal. The colony produced them as a defense mechanism when its deeper structures were threatened. The spores didn't kill. They disoriented. Disrupted spatial perception, flattened depth, turned solid walls into suggestions. In an enclosed space with sinkholes and flooded flagstones, disorientation was enough. He couldn't see the walls. He couldn't see the floor. He couldn't see Risha. He pressed the mask seal hard with both palms, checking every edge. The jaw gasket, the temple fittings, the filter chamber at the chin. The mask held, but his eyes were open to the cloud, and the spores worked through mucous membrane as readily as through lung tissue. His vision had already begun to soften at the edges. the lantern light blooming outward, the shadows between the yellow deepening into shapes that shifted when he focused on them. He stopped moving, stood completely still. Moving blind through a flooded corridor with active sinkholes was a fast way to solve the problem of being alive. He felt a hand close around his belt. Not a grab, a grip. 2 fingers hooked through the leather loop at his back, firm and deliberate, the kind of hold that communicated direction without pulling. He felt himself drawn left, a half step, and then forward. He moved with it, kept his cane ahead of him, tapping, while she pulled him through the yellow dark. He couldn't see her. He could feel the displacement of air as she moved, the slight turbulence of something large navigating a space by means that had nothing to do with sight. She didn't tap the floor. She didn't slow to check her line. She moved through the cloud the way she moved through the hanging roots, directly, with the body knowledge of someone who had walked this corridor so many times. The path lived in her feet rather than her eyes. He trusted the grip and kept moving. The lantern was useless. He shut the shutter to a sliver, conserving the flame, and used it only to watch the flagstone directly in front of his leading foot. Yellow fog sat thick above ankle height, and the sliver of lantern light at floor level gave him just enough to track stone from water. He tapped left. Solid. He tapped center. Solid. The grip at his belt pulled him 2 degrees right, and he corrected. The cane found solid ground on the right line, and he followed it. His vision was degrading steadily. The shifting shapes in the yellow had acquired more definition, which was how he knew the spores were working. Not because the shapes were real, but because his mind was supplying details to fill the gaps his eyes couldn't. He focused on the flagstone at his feet, on the physical sensation of the grip at his belt. 2 real things. He held on to them and let the hallucinated shapes stay peripheral. He heard her breathing beside him, controlled, through the nose, her mouth sealed shut. Holding the spore load out through pure discipline. She hadn't asked for the damp cloth he'd pressed against patients' faces in the journal's description of spore exposure. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled the cloth, always kept damp with the small water flask clipped inside. He held it up in the direction of her breathing. She took it without breaking stride, without changing the grip at his belt. He heard the soft displacement of fabric as she pressed it against her face. They moved. He counted steps in his head. The hall of record was 40 steps from the alcove. He'd reached 38 when the vent opened. 2 steps remaining, but the cloud had pushed him back at least 3 when he'd retreated. So 5 steps, roughly, at the pace they were moving. He counted them against the grip and the tap of his cane. On the 5th step, the grip released. He stopped. The yellow was thinning slightly, or his eyes were adapting, which was worse. He opened the lantern shutter halfway. The light pushed through the dissipating cloud and touched a wall ahead, then a doorway, then the interior of the hall of record beyond it. The air inside was clearer. The hall sat higher than the processional passage, its floor raised on a stone platform, and the spore cloud was pooling at the lower level rather than filling the interior. He stepped through the doorway and breathed. The mask filtered the residual spore load adequately. His vision began stabilizing, the peripheral shapes losing their manufactured detail, the shadows returning to being shadows. Risha came through the doorway behind him. She lowered the cloth from her face and looked at him. Her eyes were clear, no spore dilation, no soft focus. Whatever the hallucinogenic compound did to orc neurology, the answer was apparently very little. She handed the cloth back. He folded it and returned it to his coat pocket. He stood still for a moment, letting his vision finish settling. The hall of records stretched ahead, long and narrow, stone tablets lining both walls from floor to ceiling, inscribed with names and dates he couldn't read from here. 12 alcoves, she'd said. He counted them from the doorway. 12 alcoves. 12 sets of remains. Every single one was already sitting upright. The first one moved wrong. Not fast, not with the snapping urgency of the antechamber guards. This one unfolded from the stone bench in pieces, like something remembering joints it had not used in years. Its spine straightened first, then the shoulders, then the head, turning a fraction too far before correcting back toward them. Elias felt the weight of the room shift, not in air, in pattern. 12 alcoves, 12 bodies. All upright now, all facing the doorway as if they had been waiting for it to open. He did not step forward. He set the lantern on the floor instead. Low, stable. He needed both hands. The light spread outward across the raised platform, catching bronze edges, empty eye sockets, the faint green pulse threading through bone seams. The mold had not rushed these. It had arranged them. Behind him, Risha adjusted her grip on the pillar. He heard the stone scrape once against the floor as she brought it level with her shoulder. She did not advance either. "Do not let them surround," she said. He nodded, though she did not need it. His eyes were already moving, counting distance. 12 alcoves along 2 walls, narrow hall. No room to flank if they held the doorway. The platform edge dropped to the lower flooded passage behind them. If they stepped back too far, footing would break. He reached into his satchel, felt the weight of the 2 remaining saltpeter packets. Not enough for 12, not cleanly. He took 1. The nearest guard stepped down from its bier. The movement was smoother now, the earlier stiffness gone. Its foot met stone with a dull, hollow sound. The mold had learned something between chambers. Elias threw. The packet struck the floor between the first 3 alcoves and burst. White smoke climbed fast, rolling outward in a tight bloom. The nearest guard seized mid-step, its joints locking as the drying compound bit into the fungal threads binding it together. Risha moved. She stepped into the smoke without hesitation, her outline breaking through the white like a wall pushed forward. The pillar came down in a short arc, not wide, not wasteful. It struck the first guard at the collar. Bone and bronze gave at once, collapsing inward. She shifted her hands and drove the second strike low, taking the legs out from under the next before it could clear the alcove. Elias coughed into his mask. The compound scraped his throat, even through the filter. He held his ground and pulled the second packet free. The other 9 were moving now. Not rising. Advancing. They stepped down from the alcoves in unison, the timing close enough to feel deliberate. The mold pulsed brighter along their frames, the rhythm faster than before. The hall narrowed around that movement, each step echoing off the stone tablets behind them. Elias did not throw yet. He waited half a breath, watched their spacing. 3 had stalled in the smoke, 2 already down under Risha's strikes. 7 remained, closing the distance in a line that would reach the doorway in seconds. He threw the second packet not at their feet, but behind them. The pouch struck the far wall and split. Smoke rolled backward across the rear alcoves, cutting off the line's depth. The trailing guards seized first, their motion breaking. The ones in front did not stop. The mold drove them forward, abandoning coordination for momentum. Risha pivoted. She stepped back into the doorway space, narrowing the angle, forcing the front 3 to meet her one at a time. The pillar swung short again. Controlled. The first guard shattered at the shoulder, its torso collapsing sideways into the second. She used the collapse, driving the pillar forward rather than pulling it back, pushing both bodies into the third. "Left," Elias said, not loud, just enough. She shifted her stance without looking. The pillar came up and across, catching the second guard as it tried to climb over the first. The strike broke it at the spine. The third reached her then, hands out, fingers spreading wide as if to take hold rather than strike. Elias stepped in. He did not have another packet. He had a vial. He uncorked it with his teeth and threw the liquid at the guard's chest. Sulfur splashed across the fungal threads binding rib to spine. The reaction was immediate. The shriek cut through the hall, high and dry. The guard froze mid-grasp. Risha finished it with a downward blow that drove it flat to the stone. Elias staggered back a step, breath catching. The mask held, but his lungs tightened anyway, reacting to the compound and the effort both. He forced the air out slow, took the next one in smaller. The smoke thinned. The rear guards stood locked where the second packet had caught them, their frames rigid, the mold dimmed along their joints. The three closest lay in fragments at Risha's feet. No one moved. Risha lowered the pillar an inch. Not fully. Never fully. Her eyes tracked the remaining figures, measuring whether the stillness would hold or break. Elias bent, hands on his knees, and breathed. Counted it out. 4 in, 4 out. His chest resisted, then eased by degrees. "The stairs," she said. "Now!" He nodded, picked up the lantern with a hand that had not quite steadied yet. The light shook once, then settled. They stepped past the broken remains and into the hall, moving between the frozen figures before the compound could lose its hold. The tablets along the walls caught the lantern light in passing, lines of carved names, worn shallow by time and damp. He did not read them. At the far end, the stone shifted, not underfoot, in the walls. A low vibration ran through the hall, followed by a clicking sound that did not belong to bone or water. It came from deeper, many points at once, regular, advancing. Elias stopped. Risha did not. She reached back, caught his sleeve, and pulled him forward. "The rest," she said. "They are waking." The stairs were not where they should be. Elias saw the wall first, not stone in its natural state, but something layered over it, thick, pale. It bulged outward from the doorway at the end of the hall, filling the arch where the service passage should have begun. The lantern light caught its surface and died against it, swallowed into a dull sheen that looked almost soft until he stepped closer and heard the faint crackle beneath it. Fungus, not growth, structure. He stopped 3 paces from it and lifted the lantern higher. The mass had texture like calcified wax, ridged in overlapping plates that fused into one another without seam. Veins ran through it, faintly green, pulsing in a slow rhythm that did not match anything human or orc. It breathed, not air, expansion and contraction, like something pressing against the stone from both sides at once. Behind him, the clicking grew louder. Risha stepped past him and drove the end of the pillar into the mass. It did not break. The impact sank in by a finger's width, then held. The pillar stopped as if it had struck packed earth. She pulled it back. A thin crack remained where the stone had pressed, but it did not spread. The edges of it drew inward, the surface knitting itself closed with a slow, deliberate motion. "Alive," she said. "Yes." He set the lantern down again. Close to the base of the seal, he crouched, pressing 2 fingers against the surface. It was warm. Not the ambient warmth of enclosed stone. Heat generated from within. The colony had grown this deliberately, layered it, reinforced it. The clicking shifted, no longer distant. The sound had entered the hall. Elias did not look back yet. He opened his satchel. Inventory moved through his head faster than his hands. 1 sulfur solution left. 3 smoke compounds. No saltpeter. No time for careful dissolution. This was not a surface infection. This was a barrier. He took the sulfur vial anyway, uncorked it, poured a thin line along the seam where the mass met the stone arch. The reaction was immediate. The surface recoiled, pulling away from the liquid, a narrow groove opening where the sulfur burned through the outer layer. It shrieked, low and stretched, like leather tearing slowly. The groove stopped at half a finger's depth. The inner layers did not give. He capped the vial. His jaw tightened under the mask. Not enough. Behind him, something struck stone. Risha moved first. She turned, pillar already in motion, and met the first of the guards as it cleared the far end of the hall. This one moved faster than the others had, not careful, not learning, just forward. The pillar caught it across the chest and drove it back 2 steps, but it did not break cleanly. The mold held it together, threads tightening where bone should have given. Elias stood, forced himself to turn. 5 of them had reached the hall, more behind. The smoke from the earlier packets had thinned enough that the rear line was moving again, slower but steady. "We do not have time," Risha said. "I know." He looked back at the seal, then at the lantern, then at the floor. The stone beneath the doorway was darker, damp. He crouched again, pressing his palm flat. Cold water beneath, not deep. A pocket. The colony had sealed the passage from the front, but the floor beneath had been flooded earlier. He tapped it with the end of his cane. The sound came back hollow. Risha drove the pillar into the nearest guard again. This time she stepped in with it, adding her weight. The impact folded the torso, cracking the spine enough for the mold threads to snap under tension. The upper half tore free, the lower half collapsed. "Elias." "I need 10 seconds. "You have 5. He nodded once. He pulled a smoke compound vial from his satchel. Not for the air, for the floor. He smashed it down at his feet. The glass broke. The compound ignited into a thick white plume that spread low across the stone, clinging to the ground. Not enough to stop them, enough to slow footing. He drove the cane into the damp flagstone seam. Once. Twice. On the 3rd strike, the stone cracked. Water pushed through immediately, a thin line that widened as pressure found the break. He stepped back as the flagstone shifted under its own weight, tilting, then dropping inward with a dull splash. The hole opened to knee width. Dark water below. Moving. He grabbed the lantern and held it over the opening. The light caught a narrow channel running beneath the sealed passage. Not large, not safe, but open. "Down," he said. Risha did not hesitate. She stepped to the opening, dropped the pillar through first, then lowered herself after it, one hand on the edge of the broken stone, the other catching the pillar below. Water rose to her waist as she landed. She looked up. "Jump!" Behind Elias, the first guard broke through the smoke. He did not turn. He dropped into the hole. The water hit cold and hard, closing over his boots, then his knees. He caught himself against the channel wall, the lantern held high above the surface. The air down here was worse. Thick. Close. The mask seal pressed tight against his face as he drew a careful breath. Risha took his arm, not pulling, guiding. "Move." They pushed forward into the channel, water dragging at their legs, the ceiling low enough that he had to hunch. Behind them, the sound of stone breaking widened the hole. Then something dropped into the water after them. The splash came close. Not behind them in the vague way of a sound echoing through stone. Close enough that the water shoved against Elias's calves a heartbeat later, sending a cold surge up under his coat. Whatever had dropped through the broken flagstone had weight. More than one thing, maybe. The channel carried the impact forward in a hard slap that made the lantern shake in his hand. He raised it higher and kept moving. The passage under the sealed stair was no proper corridor. It had been a drainage run once, carved to carry floodwater away from the service steps before the crypt sank and the fungus learned to use every crack. The ceiling forced him low. Stone pressed close on both sides, slick with residue. Threads of pale mold clung in mats above the waterline, trembling when the current touched them. Risha could not stand straight either. She went half-crouched, one hand on the ceiling, the pillar dragging behind her through the water with a sound like a millstone being pulled over mud. Something splashed again. Elias did not look back. Looking back in a place like this cost time and balance mattered more. He kept the lantern angled ahead and tapped the submerged floor with his cane when the channel widened. Solid, then soft, then solid again. Silt had built up in pockets. If his boot sank past the ankle, he would lose it. Risha's hand found the back of his coat and held there. Not gripping this time, just contact. A point to keep him on line as the water pulled at their legs. "How far?" he asked. "The stair turns above us," she said. Her voice stayed even despite the crouch. "The runoff should meet the lower landing." Should? It did before. He accepted that answer because there was nothing else to do with it. The channel bent right. The current strengthened. He braced the lantern against the wall with his wrist and reached down with the cane, probing the turn before trusting his feet to it. The tip struck stone, slid, then found the edge of a drop no wider than a grave trench. Water spilled through it in a narrow sheet. He stopped. Lifted the lantern higher. The drop led into a lower section where the channel opened a little, enough for the current to gather force. The floor beyond was not visible through the churn. Behind them, the thing in the water closed distance. He heard the scrape first, bone or bronze dragging against stone. Then the shallow, urgent splashes of something using its hands as much as its feet. Risha shifted the pillar forward. There was no room to swing it here. "Go," she said. "There's a drop." "I know." He looked at the trench again, measured the width. A careful step could take it if the footing on the far side held. A careful step required time. They did not have time. He handed Risha the lantern. Then he crouched and lowered himself into the water until one knee found the lip of the drop. He reached across with the cane, braced it against the far edge, and used it like a third leg. His bad chest hated the angle immediately. Pressure built under the sternum. He ignored it and shifted his weight forward, boot searching through the churn until it found bottom on the other side. "Lantern," he said. She passed it over. He took it back, rose as much as the ceiling allowed, and turned to help her. She did not need help. She planted one hand on the near edge, lifted the pillar with the other, and stepped the trench in a single controlled motion despite the fresh pull in her left side. He saw the tightness in her jaw when she landed. The stitches had held, but the movement had cost her. She gave no sign beyond that one brief set of the mouth. The scraping behind them grew louder. Then a hand hit the near edge of the trench. Gray bone, bronze at the wrist, green pulse running through the seams. The guard hauled itself forward, using the trench lip as leverage. In the channel, it looked worse than the ones in the hall. The water had stripped the lingering dust from it. Mold fibers twitched openly where muscle should have been. Risha drove the butt of the pillar down on its forearm. Bone cracked. The hand dropped back into the trench. The thing did not cry out. It simply reached up again with the other arm. "No room," Elias said. "I see that." He dug in his satchel by feel. Glass neck, flat stopper, smoke compound. He pulled it free and hesitated half a breath. In a channel this tight, the smoke would choke him as much as the dead. But if that thing got over the trench, the ones behind it would follow. He smashed the vial against the near wall. White smoke burst low and thick, trapped by the ceiling. The nearest guard seized as the drying agent bit into the fungal joints. Risha drove the pillar down again. This time the forearms snapped clean and the body slipped backward into the trench, colliding with whatever had been climbing behind it. The splash that followed was heavy and confused. More than one body, tangling in the narrow drop. Elias coughed into his mask. Once. Then again, harder. The compound burned through the filter and scraped every weak place in his lungs at once. He turned his face away from the thickest smoke and forced the cough down before it became the kind that folded him. Risha took the lantern from him without asking. "Breathe later," she said. He almost laughed, which would have turned into more coughing, so he spared them both and just nodded. She moved ahead, using the lantern now, her stride shorter to fit the channel, her free hand on the ceiling for line. He followed with one hand on the wall, blinking through the sting in his eyes until the smoke thinned behind them. The channel rose by degrees. Water dropped from knee-height to mid-calf, then to ankle. Stone steps emerged under the surface, worn shallow by centuries of runoff. The lower landing. Elias felt relief hit and mistrusted it at once. He was right to. The landing ended in a wall of root. Not the calcified seal from the hall. This was older and wetter. A woven mass of thick fungal cords spilling down from the stairwell above, knotting across the rise like a fallen curtain. Water ran through it in silver threads. The roots pulsed when the lantern light touched them. Risha set the lantern on a step and pressed the pillar into the mass. The roots gave a little, then tightened around the stone as if testing it. Behind them, the splashing resumed. Elias looked from the root wall to the narrowing channel below. Their smoke had bought seconds, not safety. The dead were coming through the trench, and now the stair itself was barred by living growth. He reached into the satchel again and felt the last sulfur vial against his palm. Risha heard the glass click and looked at him. "That all?" she asked. "Yes." She nodded once and set both hands on the pillar. "Then make it count." Below them, in the dark of the channel, bronze scraped stone again. Elias weighed the last sulfur vial in his palm and knew it would not be enough. The root wall on the stair landing did not behave like an infection on skin or armor. It had depth. Layers. The outer cords looked wet and pliant, but deeper in, the mass thickened into a packed core that had grown around the stairwell itself. Sulfur would burn a hole the width of a hand and then die there. He needed force now, dry force, heat, shock, something that would make the whole structure fail at once instead of teaching it how to heal around a wound. Behind them, the dead kept coming. He crouched on the step and opened his satchel across his knees. The lantern beside Risha threw hard light over glass, cloth, and metal, over the familiar order he had built with his own hands years ago because a man with bad lungs could not afford to fumble when the air turned wrong. No saltpeter left. No alcohol worth naming. One smoke compound. The sulfur. His surgical kit. A waxed pouch of raw phosphorus scrapings wrapped in bladder skin to keep damp out. He had nearly forgotten it was there. Not because it was useless, because he had packed it for hinges. He looked at the stair wall, then at the water running through the roots, then at the broken channel below where bronze scraped stone and the splashing grew steadier with every second. The landing floor smelled wrong now that he noticed it. Not only rot and wet fungus, there was a deeper note under it, sour and trapped. The breath of old water sealed too long beneath stone. Methane. The thought settled in him with the cold clarity of diagnosis. The flooded underrun had held gases for years. The root mass had sealed the stairwell enough to trap them in pockets. Break the right place. Direct the heat inward. Dry the cords at the core before the surface could swell and smother the flame. He moved fast then, not from courage, but because the arithmetic had become simple. He passed the sulfur vial to Risha and pointed to the lower left side of the root wall, where the runoff had carved a shallow groove into the cords. She read the gesture at once. No questions. She uncorked the sulfur and poured a narrow line into the groove. The roots recoiled, writhing inward, opening a dark slip no wider than 2 fingers. That was enough. Elias pulled the phosphorus pouch free and set it on the step. His fingers were steady, though his chest had started that slow tightening again from the smoke in the channel. He ignored it and worked by habit. He split the bladder skin with his shears, shook the pale scrapings into a fold of dry lint from the bottom of the satchel, then packed the bundle into the slit the sulfur had burned. Wet mud from the stair edge went over it next, pressed flat with his thumb to hold the charge in place and force the burst toward the root core. A hand slapped the landing below. He looked down once. One of the guards had reached the top of the channel. Its head rose through the dark like something dredged from a river. Bronze helmet hanging askew, green threads working at the jaw. Risha stepped past him before he finished seeing it. She brought the pillar down in a tight vertical strike that caught the thing across the crown and drove it back into the steps below. The impact shook the landing. Water splashed their boots. Another shape moved under the surface behind it. She did not look at Elias. She did not need to. Her whole body had shifted into that hard economy she used when she understood exactly what must be protected and for how long. He struck his flint. The first spark failed. His thumb had gone slick with mud. He wiped it on his coat and struck again. This time the spark took, tiny and bright, and he tipped it into the lint at the mouth of the slit. For one breath, nothing happened. Then the stair inhaled. The blast came inward with a white crack that flattened the lantern flame and punched hot air against Elias's mask hard enough to stagger him. The mudcap held just long enough to force the ignition into the root core. Light flashed through the woven cords from within. Not fire traveling over a surface. Fire caught inside structure. The whole mass dried in an instant, every wet strand turning brittle before the colony could flood it again. Risha moved before the sound finished. She drove forward through the steam and dust, one shoulder low, pillar tucked under her arm. Elias saw the torn bandage at her ribs darken where the stitches pulled under the effort, but she did not slow. She hit the center of the stair seal with her full weight. The root wall broke. Not cleanly. It burst apart in slabs and cords, collapsing up the stairwell as much as down, the dead interior of it cracking into ash-gray chunks that bounced across the steps. Air rushed through the opening from above, cold and sharp and real. The service door beyond it, iron-bound and half-hidden behind the roots, flew inward on one screaming hinge. Below them, the dead reached the landing together. Risha turned through the dust, caught Elias by the collar at the front of his coat, and hauled him through the broken stair mouth with the same motion she used to recover the pillar. His boots left the stone for a moment. Then they were through, stumbling into the narrow service passage as the first guard lunged from the landing behind. Its hand closed on empty air where his ankle had been. Risha kicked the hanging hinge with her heel. The broken door slammed crookedly across the opening just as the swarm hit from below. Bronze and bone hammered against the wood from the other side. Cracks jumped through the old planks at once. The frame shuddered in its socket. It would not hold for long. Elias bent double, one hand braced on the wall, trying to make his lungs choose rhythm over panic. The new air helped and hurt at the same time. Cold enough to bite, clean enough to remind his body what it had been missing for too many hours. Risha stood over him in the cramped passage, chest heaving once, then settling. Dust clung to her face and to the torn edge of the bandage under her breastplate. Behind her, the door boomed again under another impact, then again, each strike louder than the last. The passage ahead sloped upward into darkness. At the far end, faint as a memory, night wind moved. The wind smelled of rain and leaf rot. Elias lifted his head toward it before he meant to. His body found the scent first, sorting it from dust, mold, old wood, and the hot residue still clinging to the back of his throat from the blast. Clean air did not belong underground. It came down the passage in thin, uneven pulls, enough to stir the lantern flame and make the skin at the edge of his mask prickle. Behind them, the door took another hit. The sound no longer carried the hard shape of single bodies striking wood. It had become a massed impact now, many frames throwing themselves against the broken planks at once. Each blow drove a tremor through the narrow passage floor. Fine grit spilled from the mortar joints overhead. The old service stair had survived centuries by being forgotten. It did not know how to survive attention. Risha looked back once, not with fear, but with the same quick accounting she brought to every bad threshold. The hinge had bent. The door sat crooked in the frame, held more by pressure than by craft. Cracks had spread through the planks, where bronze hands and skulls kept battering from the other side. On the next good hit, maybe the one after, it would fail. Elias straightened from the wall. His lungs protested, tight and hot, but they had air now, and air changed the terms of every argument a body had with pain. He picked up the lantern from where it had fallen on its side and adjusted the wick lower. No point wasting oil when the passage itself was climbing toward darkness that felt different from crypt dark. Thinner, looser, a dark with weather in it. They started up. The service passage was no grand escape route. It had been built for workers moving jars of oil and rolls of burial cloth, not for flight. The ceiling stayed low enough that Elias had to hunch, and even Risha bowed her head under the worst of the crossbeams. The floor pitched upward in uneven runs, stone worn slick by old runoff and newer seepage. Twice Elias's boot slid, and twice Risha's hand found the back of his harness before he could fall. She did not comment on it. Neither did he. There was no room left for pride in a place that kept trying to kill them by inches. Behind them, the door burst. Not all at once. First came the sharp report of one hinge tearing free. Then the lower plank split with a wet crack where the root dust had settled into the grain. Then the whole thing gave way under the weight of the dead, collapsing inward in a clatter of iron straps and rotten wood. The noise filled the service stair, rolled up the walls, and turned the narrow space behind them into a funnel for pursuit. Elias did not turn. He had spent too many hours below ground to waste vision on the exact shape of what was chasing him. Sound was enough. He heard the scrape of bronze against stone, the broken rhythm of too many feet finding the same stair at once, and beneath it all, the dry clicking of the colony driving them upward like tools. "Faster," Risha said. He almost answered that he was already moving as fast as his lungs allowed, but the words would have cost breath he could spend on climbing. So he kept the lantern high and kept going. The passage bent left, then rose in a final run toward a square of dim gray ahead. Not lantern light. Not fungus glow. Real light, weak and wide. A hatch opening stood at the top, half blocked by roots that had pushed in from outside. But these were ordinary roots, fed by soil and rain instead of the colony's hunger. Risha saw the difference at the same moment he did. She shifted the pillar to both hands and drove it upward into the blockage. Wet earth broke loose. Root strands snapped. A slab of turf and stone gave way, and cold night air poured down the passage so suddenly Elias stopped breathing for a heartbeat just to feel it. It hit his face through the mask with the smell of grass, mud, distant water, and a world that had no right to still exist after the dark below. Risha climbed through first, not to save herself, to clear the opening. She hauled the pillar out, turned, and reached down. Elias caught her forearm and let her pull him up the last 2 steps and out of the hatch onto damp ground. The night hit him whole. He staggered forward 2 paces onto grass slick with dew and dropped to his knees. The lantern slipped from his hand and rolled into the weeds, still lit. He clawed at the buckles of his mask with fingers that had gone clumsy from cold and strain. One clasp stuck. He tore it loose. Then the seal gave and he pulled the leather away from his face. The first breath of open air hurt, not because it was foul, because it was clean enough to show him, all at once, how hard he had been working for every breath below. The cold wind rushed into his chest and found every scar the mine had left him. He coughed hard, bent over his own ribs, and then dragged in another breath anyway, then another. The grass under his hands was wet and real. The mud smelled alive. Somewhere close, crickets had the nerve to go on with their small, useless music, as if crypts did not collapse and dead kings did not rot under the ground. Behind him, Risha stepped clear of the hatch and turned back toward it. The earth was already sinking. The service opening had burst through a low rise beside the ruins, hidden under nettles and a shelf of stone. Now the ground around it trembled in widening rings. Fine dirt slid inward. Roots shivered. From somewhere deep below came a long, grinding roar as the broken supports and sealed chambers began to give way to their own weight. The colony had spread through the crypt like rot through wet timber. Once its core paths broke, everything else followed. Risha did not move away. Moonlight found her where she stood at the edge of the opening, pillar planted beside her like a marker. The bronze of her armor was scarred, blackened, and half strapped together with cut leather. The bandage at her ribs had gone dark where the climb tore at the stitches. Dust marked one side of her face. She looked down into the failing earth with no triumph in her posture, no warrior's satisfaction, only a long stillness, as if some part of her had expected to hear orders from below and could not yet accept the silence instead. Then the slope folded. The hatch mouth collapsed inward in one heavy rush. Stone dropped, turf followed. A plume of dust and old spores blew up into the moonlight and then thinned in the wind. The ground settled by degrees. The roar from below dwindled to scattered cracks, then to nothing at all. Elias wiped his mouth with the back of his wrist and forced himself upright to sit back on his heels. His chest still burned, but the burning had changed. It was no longer the sealed panic of bad air. It was the raw ache that came after surviving. A better pain, one that belonged to the living. Risha lifted her face then, not to him, but to the sky above the ruins. The moon hung over the broken stones in a pale curve, thin and clear. She stood under it without speaking, as if she had not looked that far upward in a very long time. The grass bent under the wind, and then stood again. Elias sat where the hill allowed, one knee up, one hand braced in the damp earth, and let his breathing settle by slow degrees. The night had depth to it, real depth. Not the cramped kind underground, where every breath hit stone and came back wrong. Out here, the air kept moving after he exhaled, carrying the heat off his face, drying the sweat at his neck, slipping through the torn edge of his coat. His lungs still hurt. They always would. But the hurt had loosened. It no longer felt like a hand closing. The lantern had rolled into a patch of weeds and gone dim. He crawled the short distance to fetch it, more from habit than need. His fingers found the brass handle cold with dew. He turned the wick down until the flame was no more than a bead, then set the lantern beside his satchel. The little clicks of metal on metal sounded almost domestic after everything below. Small tools, small sounds. Proof that hands could still do careful work in a world that preferred breaking things. Behind him, Risha remained by the place where the hatch had caved in. The dust had settled. The hill looked almost ordinary now, if a man had not watched it collapse. A sag in the turf, fresh cracks in the stone shelf, nettles bowed under a coat of gray powder. Nothing moved there anymore. No root pulse, no bronze scrape, no clicking under the soil. The crypt had finally swallowed its own dead and closed its mouth. Risha planted the pillar upright and rested one hand on it. Moonlight found the old cuts in her armor and the newer damage from the climb. The leather strap at her side had split again. The bronze plate over her chest sat a little crooked, not from neglect, but because the body under it had changed. The thing pressing on her ribs was gone. Elias could see it in the way she stood. Not easier, exactly. More centered, as if some inward tilt had been corrected by a hand he could not see. He opened the satchel and took out the linen roll. His hands were stiff now that the urgency had passed. Stiff and tired, and not entirely steady. He worked them once, flexing the ache out of the knuckles, then pulled the bandage free and dampened a corner with the last clean water from his flask. When he rose and went to her, she looked down at him at once, alert in that old sentinel way, but she did not shift her footing. She knew what he had come for. The bandage at her ribs had gone dark where the stitches had pulled during the climb and the charge through the broken root wall. Not soaked through, not a fresh rupture. Seepage. He lifted the edge of the breastplate and checked the wrapping beneath. The linen was warm from her skin and gritty with dust. He unwound it carefully, one pass at a time, the night wind moving over his bare hands. The stitches had held, 4 small knots still tight. The skin around them was angry from strain, but closed. He cleaned the dried blood away with the damp cloth, wiped the dust from the thread, and laid a fresh strip over it. Risha stood without comment, looking out over the ruin field while he worked. That was trust, too, though it wore a quieter face than the surgery in the alcove. No iron stillness now. No challenge in it. Just the ordinary acceptance of another pair of hands doing what needed doing. He tied the knot at her side and pressed the end flat. She glanced down then, not at his face, but at the bandage itself, checking the tension with the practiced eye of someone who had lived too long around wounds to romanticize any of them. Satisfied, she drew the breastplate back into place and tightened the broken strap as far as it would go. For a while they said nothing. The ruins around them held the silence of old places after rain. Blocks of stone lay half sunk in the hill, outlines of walls that had once stood higher. Moss caught along the edges. Farther off, black trees ringed the clearing, their trunks moving in and out of moonlight as the clouds thinned. Somewhere down the slope, a trickle of water ran over rock. Elias listened to it and thought how strange it was that water could sound innocent when it had spent the last hours trying to drown him in the dark. He sat again, slower this time, and began repacking what remained of his tools. The empty sulfur vial went into one pouch, the used thread wrappers into another, shears folded, scalpel wiped and wrapped in oilskin, nothing wasted, even now. He had lived too long by salvage to leave a good instrument dirty just because he was tired. As he worked, he felt Risha watching once or twice, not in suspicion, but with that same puzzled attention she had given the sage smoke and the mask and every other small human ritual of survival. There was not much left to pack. The satchel felt light when he closed it, too light. Most of what had made him useful underground had been spent below the hill. Compounds gone, filters nearly done. Even the mask had a tear at one seam where he had ripped it loose in the grass. He touched the damaged edge with his thumb and let his hand fall. Risha lowered herself to the ground across from him with the care of someone measuring what her healing ribs would tolerate. The earth sank a little under her weight. She rested her forearms on her knees and looked at the collapsed hatch, then at the tree line beyond it. then finally at him. Her face in the moonlight had lost the fever's shine. The gray of her skin looked like skin again, not ash stretched over stone. When she spoke, her voice came rough from smoke and old discipline, but no longer from the colony's grip. "The watch is over." Elias followed her gaze to the hill. It was not hard to understand what the words cost. An oath could outlive the king who demanded it. It could outlive the walls built to hold it. Sometimes it outlived the person forced to carry it. He had seen smaller versions of the same thing in mining towns, in field hospitals, in men who kept obeying orders long after the war that birthed those orders had rotted away. The dead always asked for one more year if someone was foolish enough to keep listening. He closed the satchel flap and rested both hands on it. "Good," he said, and nothing more. She considered that with the same grave attention she brought to a root or a wound. Then she lifted one hand to the bandage at her ribs, not pressing on it, only feeling the clean linen there under the bent edge of bronze. Her mouth shifted by the smallest amount. Not a smile. Something drier, more private. The wind moved again, carrying the smell of wet grass down from the slope and the colder scent of open country beyond the ruins. A path led away through the broken stones, little more than a game trail under nettles and moonlight. But it was there. Elias looked at it, then at the satchel, then at the woman who had spent too many years standing in the same patch of dark for the sake of bones that were now dust beneath a fallen hill. He got to his feet with a wince he did not bother hiding. Risha rose after him and pulled the pillar free of the ground. For a moment they stood side by side, facing the path, neither hurrying to claim what came next. The night did not offer promises. It offered distance, weather, sore lungs, half-broken armor, and the practical problem of where to sleep before dawn. That was enough. More than enough. Elias lifted the lantern. Risha adjusted the strap across her chest. Then they left the buried crypt behind and walked into the wind.